Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table to discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week.
Woohoo.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I am bringing the second article in the series from Inquest that's called Abolitionist Lessons from the Prison Belt. This article is about abolition and environmental justice. And again, this is a conversation between Lydia Pelot-Hobbs, Judah Schept, Craig Gilmore, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And the introductory text to this article, I think, sets up our conversation really well today.
Okay.
So I'll just say what they said.
Yeah.
Quote, joint action by abolitionists and environmental justice organizers didn't come out of transactional coalition building, but from organizers' work unearthing a shared set of movement interests: disposability, land use, organized abandonment, and consciousness. We discuss how organizations in both traditions have taken on each other's struggles, forging common purpose among differently affected people facing both spectacular and everyday forms of harm in overlapping and discontinuous geographies. So there's some great conversation in here about how environmental groups started to figure out the damage that prisons and the prison industrial complex does to the planet.
Yes.
And how abolitionist organizations also started to piece that together to work together more closely with environmental groups, and what that coalition work has looked like, and some really great analysis about all of that. But let's get into it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, great intro. I've really been looking forward to our conversation about this piece, not only to just continue to be able to dive into this series from Inquest, because it's been incredible, but also to continue our conversation, an ongoing conversation about the topic of environmental justice, like the one we got to have last week. So thanks for bringing this piece to the table. And it was, as I said, incredible. It was another great conversation between Lydia and Judah and Craig and Ruth, specifically for me around their conversation about the themes of environmental justice in the context of the struggle against the prison industrial complex, and just the connectedness of environmental justice and the prison industrial complex, which I think is something that maybe we don't always think about, and how that presents an opportunity for organizers to work together in this fight, as you mentioned, with the coalition.
Yeah.
And so Ruth Wilson Gilmore says this early on in their conversation. This is kind of where I want to start. Quote, following the same lines in my written comments to the Environmental Impact Report, I suggested that the lecture community should join forces with whoever lives in the place where the toxic detritus of the construction, the equivalent of 8 Empire State Building's volume of mine spoil, would end up, and working as a geographically discontinuous environmental justice community, they could fight together. These are possibilities for organizers to think about: how an understanding of a specific place-based vulnerability can be transformed into solidarity at regional and larger scales with people that the local people don't yet know. And I just think that's a really great point and strategy for organizers to consider. It's this idea of how organizers and organizations can team up, can work together, can be a part of that coalition, as you mentioned, in the work in one specific place, but then to have an impact on somewhere else and at a larger scale. And I just think that's a really powerful strategy here.
Yeah, finding other people to join in the work with you, I think, is a big part of organizing.
Absolutely.
And being able to connect with those people and activate them into
Yes.
whatever it is that work might look like, I think is really, really powerful. So one of the things that's mentioned early on was a set of questions that I think could guide some really powerful decision-making around organizing and building coalitions across different organizations.
Okay.
So Lydia Pelot-Hobbs says, quote, how can we get people to recognize these everyday relations, exacerbated in our current context by climate change, but by no means new? When people incarcerated at Angola filed their lawsuit in the 1970s, a key complaint was that there was sewage being pumped right underneath their dorms and dining hall, making people ill. How can we bring to the forefront these environmental aspects, not only when they are headline grabbing? How does our organizing make visible the everyday ways that environmental racism and environmental injustice are fundamental to the prison state in all its forms? And I appreciated that. I think
Yes.
finding ways to make the normal, everyday violence of these systems common knowledge is a powerful theme of this discussion.
Yep.
And it reminds me of some of the discourse that's been happening online this past week about political violence.
Yes.
Where the sensational moment of a public execution of someone is decried as political violence. But these same folks calling for empathy for the dead person are cheering on a concentration camp built on the Everglades and gleefully cheered for the dangerous alligators that would allegedly happily eat any detainees who might escape from that camp.
Yep.
Or who regularly call for state violence against undocumented immigrants or people who are protesting the genocide in Palestine. Those things aren't considered political violence because they're within the arbitrarily accepted bounds of policy. And because it fits their narrative, because it's not about them and it's not their group of people.
Right.
But the sensationalized event that happens, like raw sewage flowing through a prison,
Yep.
well, that's terrible. We should address that. But the conditions of the system created that raw sewage. And so it's
right.
The mundanity of the thing created the sensationalism. So we have to address the mundaneness of it.
Right.
It's not about that one sensational piece. It's the whole thing is rotten.
Absolutely.
The whole thing is sewage.
The whole thing is sewage. There he goes. You all should have seen the look on his face there. He's very happy with that. No, I very much so appreciate that. This idea of how to make the everyday violence of these systems and structures a part of our collective common knowledge and discourse. I think that was a really powerful part of and theme of this conversation. And I think that's so important because that's exactly how some of these systems and structures are designed and exactly what they're designed to do. I also really appreciate the fact that you called it a public execution and not an assassination, because that's not what that happened this week, even despite some of the news that we saw. Yeah. So great stuff there. Judah actually builds off of your point, Lydia's point there, and talks about the parallels between what she talked about and how we talk about police violence and state violence at large. So Judah says this about how we talk about violence, quote, "We can easily identify it when it is expressed in its most spectacular forms, like the police murders of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or countless others. But we have a harder time identifying it as violence and organizing around it as violence when it is a city council expanding a jail budget or thousands of people subjected to daily arrests or short jail stints, or other seemingly mundane operations of the carceral state. There's something that's so visceral and egregious in a prison being built on a strip-mined mountaintop removal site where the environmental devastation has an almost cinematic quality. But we're not necessarily able to organize around the more everyday expressions of the same social forces." And so for me, all of that is just a great continuation, again, of what we've been talking about and just their analysis in this conversation. And thinking about something like Judah's example here of a city council expanding a jail's budget, like that is violence, right? That's absolutely violence. And we have to recognize it as such and fight against it just like we would fight against any other kind of state and carceral violence that feels more, as you said, sensationalized and massive and big and in our face.
Yeah, and connected to that, I think Craig Gilmore says, quote, "But we can't simply wait for popular outrage at the next egregious moment.
Yes.
Law enforcement strategy is we can make the spectacular less spectacular by doing it more often and making it mundane, at least in terms of the news cycle. Police killings haven't gone down. Police killings have gone up in the United States. Deaths in custody have gone up. But that's all harder and harder to organize around because it happens so often. So I think it's all the more essential that we figure out ways to essentially organize around the mundane. If some of the people who've been mobilized by the most spectacular and newsworthy events come along, that's great." So I appreciate this idea about not waiting for the popular outrage and organizing around the mundane.
Yes.
Because the mundane is what creates the spectacular moment.
Yes,
as we
there
said
it is.
Earlier.
There it is, yes.
The mundane is the prison in Angola not being taken care of for however long and existing in the way that it does to then have raw sewage flowing underneath it.
Yes.
And so how do we get people to work around the boring local government budget hearings that we've determined is violence? Because in many ways, the decisions will lead to violence there.
Right.
and other mundane parts of local government to really get involved in these policy decisions that ultimately drive a lot of movement on local levels that could lead to less violence.
Right.
Or to more life-giving institutions that are helpful to us and actually serve us in ways beyond throwing us away into cages or whatever else the state has done and continues to do to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of organizing and fighting for the things that we need versus all that we know. And we know that those things are killing machines and hurting us. And I think you referenced Craig's quote there. I think you left out a curse word.
I did.
He cursed in there.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you did it. But I love that he cursed in that, because it's all so infuriating to recognize exactly what law enforcement and the state have been doing for all the years. And so I definitely appreciated Craig's point. Later in the conversation, Lydia Pelot-Hobbs shifts the conversation slightly to connect all of this discussion about our collective consciousness of what's happening as a result of movement work and activism to environmental injustice. And she asks some really powerful questions too. And so she says, quote, "This question of how consciousness gets built by movement activity, turning apparently boring questions of land use procedure into skirmishes in fights for justice, is so important. What does it mean for people who have been abandoned structurally, who have had these spectacular forms of violence become everyday, to come to share an understanding of how we got here? People start saying, of course they want to put a prison here. Of course they don't just evacuate the jails. There's a shared consciousness which people have developed through generations of struggle around these kinds of intrusions by extractive industries and against the withdrawal of life-sustaining supports. A sort of consciousness forms when people can politicize the accumulation of all of those little decisions that make us say, of course, to the exceptional events in particular regions, everyday land use decisions, everyday budget decisions, the mundane ways the devaluation of people's lives in particular places gets put into practice. That consciousness could be defeatist, but organizational activity can help give shape and action to the interpretation we're encouraging." And I just thought that that was a great set of questions there, and certainly analysis, and particularly for me, those statements where, she's saying, of course this happened, and of course that happened, is something that happens all the time. And so her point of how that consciousness could instead be used as fuel for organizing work or in organizing work, to me, is really powerful. So powerful. In fact, I struggled here because I was like, I should bring this for application, because I feel like it's application, but it's just, I couldn't let us not talk about it.
Yeah, that was great. I had that highlighted too.
Yeah.
Went down a different path.
Yes.
All right, well, let's talk about application. Yeah. How does this article apply to our day-to-day lives and work?
Okay.
At the end of this article, Ruth Wilson Gilmore is sharing some ideas about how we need to be forward-thinking in our organizing. Okay. And she's referencing an earlier part of this conversation where the group was talking about floods in Kentucky and how they impacted the work and perspective there. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, quote, "In the Kentucky context, I imagine the floods will continue to be a central part of any program or policy or concept, whether it's from federal authorities, county administrators, or the state. Not only because there was so much devastation from the floods, but also because political mobilization happened as a result of the floods. That compels us to ask how we can break cycles that become opportunities for merely reformist reform without being insensitive to the particular needs and motivations expressed by particular political mobilizations. How can organizers approach these moments so that we refresh people's understanding of what is happening? For example, at the beginning of this conversation, I suggested fostering solidarity between a community from which mine spoil is being removed and whatever community is slated to receive that toxic waste. Because the alternative is to yield to whoever, state or capital, attempts to domesticate movement energy. Oh, we see the problem, and we have a remedy that enhances already existing power differentials, including land use decisions. The process isn't inevitable, but we need to think dynamically about the strategic common sense we're building in order to prepare other people and ourselves for the next round of the fight." So there's a point in the middle of that where she says how organizers approach these movements so that we refresh people's understanding of what's happening, which I think is a crucial part of political education, which is a huge part of shared understanding of what conditions we're actually living in.
Yes.
and always having a framework of where we've been and where we're going and how this current moment fits into the patterns of history.
Yes.
And I think all of that is so crucial. And I think the end part there is very important. What's the common sense we're trying to create in our people, with our people? What's the current acceptable set of circumstances, and what are we trying to build? So how do we create understanding of what could be in a world that feels very set in its ways and resistant to change? I think those are all pieces that she's naming there that are driving us forward in terms of, meaningful change that we need to make.
Absolutely. Well, I love the two things you called out there. This idea of the political education that's necessary and why it's necessary, particularly in environmental justice work and movement work in general. But I appreciate her in this conversation helping to make those connections for us and for organizing work and certainly for environmental justice. My application actually also comes from Ruth, which is great. She's incredible. And it basically connects everything we've talked about here today in a nice little bow as it relates to what's central in the fight for environmental justice, I think. So she says, quote, land use decisions frequently concentrate cumulative violence, whether it's to humans, water, air, flora, or fauna, such as kangaroo rats. It's crucial to successful movement building to be able to show to people whose organizations might join in solidarity with abolitionist movements or become abolitionists themselves that the accumulated harms of organized abandonment that they are encountering are part of a continuum with the organized violence, including criminalization and incarceration, that got us all motivated in the first place. This consciousness building is fundamental to all work that we do. And I just couldn't agree with that more. And I hope organizations and organizers sort of heed that incredible advice and analysis as they continue the good work.
Yeah, I think that's so important to recognize those patterns and how criminalization and incarceration are connected to this continuum of organized violence and organized abandonment and what that actually all has led to.
Yeah, and how it's all linked.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's talk about homework. How do we want to continue our learning, unlearning beyond our conversation today? My homework is to continue reading and talking about this Abolitionist Lessons from the Prison Belt series on the podcast, because clearly it's chock full of great ideas and analysis of where the abolitionist movement is at and where it can go. So that's my homework. How about you?
Yeah,
what do you got?
That sounds great to me. I'll co-sign that because I definitely want us to continue these conversations and reading this incredible series and learning more about environmental justice and abolition from these just incredible scholars. There were also quite a few environmental disasters and situations that they talked about in this piece, including prisons being built in these flood zones or when the sewage running underneath them, or prisoners being used to fight wildfires. And so I just want to kind of click through and the links in the piece and do some more research into those situations and learn more about what's going on just sort of across our country as it relates to these injustices.
Yeah. Definitely. I think there was a lot of things that they reference here that would make sense to know a little bit more about.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's it for our conversation today on abolition and environmental justice from Inquest. And Damien, you are up next time. What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Yeah. So I'm going to take us back to our friends Hammer and Hope and bring another piece from their latest issue for us to talk about in our next episode. I was really compelled by the title of this piece and who wrote it. So the piece I'm bringing is called Building an Opposition to Survive the Trump Era, written by the one and only Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. And it just feels all the more necessary to read this as we navigate every single day. And I was away this weekend and I felt like every night when colleagues of mine got together, it was like, what 7 things happened today, right? Like in this single day, all the things that happened, and we had some time to process those things before we had to go on to do things. So the caption for this piece reads, quote, mass protests have demonstrated a wide range of disagreement with the Trump agenda, but we need smaller local and regional networks to build a more rooted, sustained opposition. And I also think that really connects to a lot of what we just talked about today in this Inquest piece. So yeah, I think any opportunity to engage with Hammer and Hope and certainly Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor about how we all can get free is worth it. So I'm looking forward to reading this piece and talking about it with you next time.
Me too. That's another one that I initially thought I might bring for the last time when I brought Hammer and Hope and was looking forward to reading this one at some point. So,
Yes.
yeah. All right, good stuff. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.